We're still discussing the 23rd edition of the World Economic Forum on Africa, and still with me is Yunus Suleiman. He's chairman of KPMG for South Africa and Africa. Also with us is Claude Besek. He's an economist from Unomics. Claude, a key focus area this year is strengthening the continent's competitiveness and fostering inclusive growth to build resilience in what is a very volatile global environment. Where do we start? Because getting this right comprises quite a few elements. Where does the priority lie?
Well, I think the first foundation is always, unfortunately, and sounds terribly boring, but macroeconomic stability. You have to have, currency stability. You have to have your public deficits in order. You have to maintain your debt level at a sustainable point. And Africa has done extraordinary things in the past 20 years, very, very painfully at times. At these years, the dark years of restructuring and stabilizations. But these bad years set up the foundations. So that has to be there, it has to be remaining there. And then you have to have the right investment climate. Our other speaker was talking about that, making sure that the regulatory framework is the right one, the legal frameworks is the right one, that you have the rule of law. These are foundations of it.
And on that front, you've worked with leading economic, political, and then security consultancies as well. You've been a consultant to the World Bank and the IFC on investment, climate reform and growth policy. So when it comes to appropriate investment policies on the continent, what do you tell these various groupings when you play an advisory roles? Because we have a situation when it comes to some governments, they're adopting, frankly, what are quite nationalistic policies and deterring investment in a very big way.
Well, it's a balancing act, and per se, I am not saying that nationalistic policies are bad. I mean, we have a whole tradition in Europe and Asia and Latin America of fairly nationalistic policies that were focused on creating intent economic development, and in some cases they worked. You see, there's a difference. You have to have a national goal of economic development. You have to say, this is where we want to go as a country, and these are the policies we're going to develop. But they have to be investment friendly. You can have a somewhat nationalistic, state-centric economic policy, provided it is focused on creating positive outcomes for the private sector and for the citizenship
because
at large.
Instability in that regard, Yunus, really rocks the boat when it comes to relationships, the relationships between the public and the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the National Development Plan that's with this vision for 2030 for South Africa, I mean, it's a brilliant plan. And I think the key thing is it's part of the country's plan. It's not the government plan, it's the people's plan. And if we could achieve the vision for 2030 in terms of that plan, we would have done extremely well as a sort of major or largest economy on the continent. And it's going to deal with the critical issues of creating employment, reducing poverty, having the right infrastructure. There's lots of things there. It's exciting stuff, but it's getting everyone behind that plan to implement. And that's the detail that we've got to focus on. How do we implement?
Perhaps not talked about as often as we should be is the trust issues between the parties involved here. When we're talking private sector and public sector, trust seems to be that missing ingredient from the relationship at large, Claude.
Absolutely, and I think it's a lot of it is come from historical factors, and seeing a diversification in the source of capital investment, in the type of private sector actors, I think contributes to building that trust. To simply having the traditional division between South as investment destination and North as emitters of capital reinforce the mistrust. Having South-South dialogue and investment, having indigenous capital arising, creates a new dynamic in that environment. But the key issue about what do you do as a developmentalist and what is our advice? It's always to tell government, do what you can do, provided you make sure that the private sector can operate within the price right environment.
So let's take a look at how that dynamic then translates to developing infrastructure on the continent, because part of the outcome of this year's meeting is to renew commitment to a sustainable growth path, and a large chunk of that relies on adequate infrastructure being in place to facilitate business on the continent and to make sure that Africa is in fact open for business.
Correct. And the key issue of price is central to that. We cannot possibly in Africa develop the badly needed infrastructure, whether it's water, electricity, transports, ports, airports, and so on and so forth, if we have developmental policies that actually stop us from being able to leverage the market prices. And that's very difficult to do. The big constraint of Africa is that we have small markets. We have 55 countries that all of them have fairly small markets. So there cannot be a mechanism for sustainable infrastructure development that does not involve integration and does not involve sharing of those platforms within the right capital raising framework, the right regulatory and legal frameworks. How it's done, it really depends on what the infrastructure is. We are working on projects in Central Africa where we're trying to do is leverage our clients, in this case private companies, our clients' projects where the country as a whole can benefit from that. So that's the kind of PPP from a private sector offering standpoint. It's got to be beneficial. And we've seen in countries like Mozambique what happens when private sector projects are not perceived to be beneficial to the country at large. These projects do not go forward and the investment disappears. So the equation has to be public utility, private sector funding or cooperative funding, and economic benefit and usage at large.
And it's an equation that we have to get right, Eunice, because the costs incurred as a result of inadequate infrastructure being in place is quite large here. So when do you see us getting to a point where infrastructure investment is supportive of Africa being open for business?
Well, if you look at KPMG, I mean, we have structured our investment efforts in terms of infrastructure by having a global team working together. At the World Economic Forum this week, we have our global head of infrastructure, we have our Europe, Middle East head of infrastructure, as well as our Africa head of infrastructure working together. And Nick Chisholm, who is the global head, will be actually moderating the session on infrastructure in Cape Town. And I think that's an important pillar, which is receiving a lot of attention. And I think the key thing is, how do you lower the cost of doing business in Africa? If you look at countries where electricity is, let's call it, not ideally set up, countries where the road network is not good enough, and the rail, etc., it increases the cost of doing business significantly, which makes it more of a deterrent in terms of an investment return. But I think the key thing that companies need to understand is that Africa does provide high risk, but high return as well. So it's in our interest to really work together, both from a global investment point of view and from a local investment point of view, to reduce the cost of doing business. When
it comes to the funding of the cost of what it's, the cost of actually setting up this infrastructure and building infrastructure, moving forward, where do your views lie there? Because we've had the BRICS, for example, getting very vocal about that, to the extent that they're looking at setting up a developmental bank to fund that specifically.
There's a lot of unanswered questions in regard to concessions in respect of interest, for example, and the BRICS Development Bank is a good concept. I think if it gets off the ground, it will provide access to funding which may be cheaper than the conventional commercial banks. And that's receiving opposition from the commercial banks to say we're going to lose business. But I think the environment is such that we need to have unique solutions, because it's not business as usual.
We're looking at access to capital there. What about access to human capital? Because another theme that's going to be addressed this year, Claude, is unlocking talent specifically, and with that, human capital gets put in the spotlight.
I think there is a great dislocation there. And certainly Africa is not providing enough opportunity for its people. It certainly is not offering enough opportunities for the millions of Africans who have left Africa for the past 40 years and have set up sometimes very successful businesses. In other cases have joined other governments and development agencies, and in many, many other cases are doing the jobs that Europeans and Americans don't want to do anymore, but in the process have gotten skills and education and a level of capacity that the continent needs to have. So for me, one of the questions is, how do we bring back the skills that Africa has lost to Africa so that they can be leveraged to economic development? Because we talk about policies and we talk about infrastructure, but really economic development is about people. and it's about skills, and it's about creating environments where the right people with the right skill can provide their incredible creativity and services to the economy and releasing the human factor.
Is enough of a focus, Eunice, in your opinion, placed on leadership and grooming of that skill and of that talent?
You know, Africa has got so much of skills, and as Claude says, they are exported. The big challenge is to attract them back, and that's where, if you look at the Americans, they've actually done a great job.
We don't lose them in the first place.
Yeah, we don't. But I'm saying if we could create the right environment to attract them back, it'll be fantastic. Although I think the economic crisis globally has actually worked in our favor because the opportunities have reduced, and therefore people are looking to come back. But I think we've got an educated population. We have got people that are hungry to learn more, and they are also thankful of having a job. But the key thing is having the right environment and the right political stable incentive for them to come back and to feel that they're actually giving back to the countries from where they come from.
When it comes to perception versus reality doing business on the continent, I came through across an interesting report this afternoon. There's a stark perception gap between those who are already doing business in Africa versus those who have not yet invested in the continent. How much of a gap do you think there is right now between perception and reality?
Look, it's an interesting notion that if you practice Africa, you become a lot less scared about it simply because you're doing it. I think the perception of risk is decreasing, certainly. You can see that when you go to the Western and Eastern capital and talk about Africa. It is becoming part of the known world, if you want, the terra cognita of investment and business. But it is still reserved to resource sectors, a bit more in finance now, and consumer services, but certainly it's not where it should be. The perception, unfortunately, is unaided by the continuous bad news that come from certain regions of Africa, where you hear about rabid nationalism of the wrong kind, that is, when you see coups d'etats and rebellions and civil wars, and there is still far too much of that in Africa. But obviously that means that a lot of people are throwing the baby with bathwater. And that's where we can do a loop back onto the WEF and say that this is the kind of forums where a conversation about Africa can positively educate people as to the fact that it is becoming less risky, it is becoming more business as usual. There are challenges, but they can be rationally, at least in a lot of jurisdictions now, they can be rationally, reasonably addressed, whereas in the past, irrationality was perhaps more common.
Eunice, I alluded to the BRICS grouping a little earlier. When it comes to building with BRICS, I mean, how do you see that collaboration actually helping Africa deliver?
I think, when you look at it, I mean, Africa, or let's call it South Africa, is the smallest of the five. If you look at the volume or the value of the GDP they contribute, which is significant, 30% of the GDP globally comes from those 5 countries. I think we could benefit more in the context of sort of collaborating and exporting to each other, or working together in developing more value to our products, and that could create more employment. At the moment, it's all exporting natural resources, or and not getting the extreme value that can come out of converting them into value-added products. Yeah. So I think that there is a glue coming about between the 5 countries, and we could benefit significantly in the process because we have common, call it, cultures. If you look at the World Cup as an example, we hosted a fantastic World Cup in 2010. Brazil's going to host it in 2014, and we can collaborate with each other because we have a background which is similar, and I think that's important in actually, in terms of BRICS playing a role in bringing that glue together with us 5 countries working together and creating environments like the Business Council, talking to each other regularly, the BRICS Development Bank, whatever it may be, that to bring us more closer together. Yeah, that will help the emerging economy.